We are a year away from the general election, but I think the lesson that we get from these numbers is just how much depends on making sure that we can invite every American into our vision of the future.
It's Wednesday, November 6th. I'm Julie Pace, Washington Bureau Chief for the Associated Press. And this is Ground Game. In 1 year, Americans will decide whether to give President Donald Trump a second term in the White House or hand control to a still-to-be-determined Democrat.
While we are creating jobs and killing terrorists, the radical Democrats are going totally insane.
There's so much we don't know about how the next year will unfold. Will Trump be running as an impeached president? Will a strong economy get him over the finish line? And by the way, who will his opponent be?
This country cannot afford 4 more years of Donald Trump. We will not recognize it if he gets reelected.
Democrats are still locked in an intense primary fight over the future of their party and which candidate is best positioned to defeat Trump.
If the best Democrats can offer is business as usual after Donald Trump, Democrats will lose.
But for some candidates, time and money are running out.
Though this is the end of this campaign, we are right in the middle of this fight.
We'll head to Iowa, site of the kickoff caucuses, to find out who's up, who's down, and who is dropping out. Sunday marked 1 year until the 2020 presidential election. And if that feels like an eternity, well, it kind of is. But it's also going to be a fascinating year where we learn a lot about our country and our politics. Here to help take stock of where we are, Stephen Sloan, AP's national political editor, one of the few people in the country who has already spent a full year on election coverage. Stephen, thanks for being with us.
This is not a sudden everybody.
This did not just pop up in your world that we're
exactly
talking about politics right now. So we are 1 year away. And I think for those of us who have been engaged in this, it does suddenly feel like this is all very real. But just help us take stock of where we are right now as a country. We're staring down the 1 year mark. President Trump, we know, will be on the ballot. Democrats are still trying to figure this out. Where are we 1 year out from Election Day?
I think we're very divided, right? The divisions that have kind of defined the Trump era are still there. They're not going anywhere. I also think that people are really tuned in. We've seen that in our own polling over the past week or so. People are a year out from this election kind of tuned in ways that you would often see kind of a few months out from the election. Considering, as you say, we have an entire year to go, you can only kind of imagine that that's going to increase. So you have a lot of division out there and you have a lot of people tuned into politics. That probably is a recipe for a lot more polarization, a lot more intense rhetoric kind of in the political space over the next year.
And this is both parties, right? This is not just Democrats or Republicans, one or the other, being excited.
Oh, this is both sides. I think that that Republicans, especially, the president's supporters, are really ready to go out to the polls to support him. And we've seen in polling and just kind of anecdotally when we've been out in these early states with these Democratic candidates who are making their case, there are hundreds of people showing up to see these candidates in towns that sometimes only have a few thousand. So when you get 300 people, it's kind of a big deal. People are really engaged.
So that's what we know, that we're going to probably head into this election deeply divided. But there's so much that we don't know, so much we're going to learn over the next year. And I think some of the big unanswered questions are, of course, where Democrats go in this. They are fighting out this big primary that has really, I think, raised questions about the future of that party. What are you going to be looking for about how Democrats start to answer that question of who they are as a party?
Well, so there are so many candidates, but there's really kind of two lanes that are emerging here. You have the Sanders-Warren lane of people who just fundamentally want to systematically restructure the way that this nation's economy works, the way that kind of American life functions in kind of, dramatic ways that we haven't seen in a century, maybe. And in the other lane, you have people like Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, who are taking a more incremental approach. They share some of the same goals, perhaps, but ultimately would get their kind of smaller, bite-sized approach, more openness to working with the Republicans. I think the early days of this primary will really be figuring out, okay, which lane do Democrats really want? And I think that nobody knows right now where that will go.
And ultimately, this isn't just a question of what you think is best in terms of governing in Washington. This is a question of which direction Democrats think is to beat Trump, right?
And that is, I think, one of the big dividing points. You have people like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders who say, look, we have to go big with big ideas, big, bold plans. We can't just, kind of talk about what we can't do. We have to go really big here, and that's going to inspire our voters to show up nationally and in these critical blue wall states that we're all going to obsess over the next year. This is what's going to bring people out into the polls. Talking about kind of step-by-step, moderate approaches isn't going to win. Now, if you're Joe Biden, if you're Klobuchar, Buttigieg, and you're especially targeting those voters who maybe voted for Obama and then switched to Trump in 2016, you're saying, look, the math here is on my side. We have to win back those voters to take back states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. The name of the game here is 270 electoral votes. You present yourself as extreme, you're going to lose those voters. We're going to lose this election again.
And the tension, we've been out there talking to these voters, the tension within the Democratic Party about what the answer to this question is just so raw because they are so desperate to beat Trump after 2016.
Yeah, there's really not a lot of middle ground here. You are kind of either in this lane of people who are proposing these big, ambitious proposals are crazy and dangerous, or you are saying that the candidates who taking a more moderate approach are just in a different era, who don't understand what's happening in the real world anymore. And you don't see a lot of kind of waffling in between. And again, we're a year out.
Of course, the issue that this has played out the most clearly in the Democratic primary has been over health care. We sort of joke about this when every debate starts because it does start with a discussion over the future of health care. But I do think it's because, one, the issue is really important to Americans in their everyday lives. And two, we do see this division so clearly. The big development on this front over the last couple of days was Elizabeth Warren coming out with her Medicare for All plan, finally putting some meat on the bones and explaining how she would pay for this big program. Her top line from this is that she could do this plan, this big government takeover of healthcare without raising middle class taxes. But I know your team dug into the details on this a little bit. What did you guys find about the realities of what Warren is proposing?
The realities, I think, are tougher than what she is suggesting. First of all, on the cost, she's suggesting this is a $20.5 trillion plan, which, by the way, is still a lot of money on its own, right? But, independent analysis that has been conducted, even by people that she has consulted, suggests it's far more expensive on the scale of $35 trillion. Just stopping there for a minute, it's hard to see how you can get legislation like that passed through Congress. That's just such a heavy price tag that even, if you had 60 Democratic votes in the Senate, that is really hard to piece together how that would work. And then how you actually pay for that. I am a former tax reporter. I spent 2 or 3 years of my life.
We love having Stephen on our team, a former tax reporter.
Covering tax issues. The revenue that she is looking to, some of it is really hard to believe that would actually materialize. Everybody talks about tougher IRS enforcement, but it is really hard to actually go out and find that revenue through those sources. And if the cost ends up being more expensive than $20 trillion and you already are potentially really scrounging deep in the couch for that pocket change, it's hard to add up.
One of the other ways that Warren says she would go about funding Medicare for All would be passing comprehensive immigration reform, something that is proven impossible for Democratic and Republican presidents to do. So I think we're going to hear Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg, we're already starting to see this start to go after her, not just on the top line numbers, but also I think on the feasibility of what she's even proposing here.
Well, the thing that I think that kind of comes out of this Medicare for All debate is that it really crystallizes. We've kind of had this theoretical conversation about big policy changes versus kind of the more incremental, let's work together approaches. And that's been kind of a little pie in the sky and rhetorical. Now we actually have numbers associated with it. We have a plan. And I think that is what Elizabeth Warren has contributed to this conversation right now. And so you'll see that conversation play out in more specific ways than what we've seen so far.
The Medicare for All debate also has been giving President Trump, Republicans, some fodder for what I think one of their lines throughout this campaign this next year will be, which is that Democrats are socialists, that they are trying to remake government. They are trying to insert government into your lives. If you are a Joe Biden, if you're an Amy Klobuchar, a Pete Buttigieg, do you have to take that on directly? Pete Buttigieg has this line that I think is really interesting where he says, they're going to paint us all as socialists no matter what we actually propose. How do they kind of deal with this attack line from the president?
I think that Buttigieg is probably right. You could have the most conservative Democrat in the field right now emerges the nominee and the president and his allies would likely paint them as another tax and spend, big government Democrat. So that argument, is not going away. And I think, we'll have to look to see if Democrats just kind of ignore it and focus on other things. One of the things I will say about Warren, she had this big speech at Democratic dinner over the weekend in Iowa. And she had this line that has just really stuck with me since I heard it, kind of going after people who think small and quit early. And I think that was a really interesting kind of way for her to define this, for her to take the conversation away from socialism, to take the conversation away from kind of this cul-de-sac that we've been in a little bit, to really say this is about, we're either going to fight, go hard here for the ideals that we care about, or, quit early. And so I think that's the conversation that we'll see a little bit.
Obviously, a president running for re-election, that the contest is often a referendum on their first 4 years in office. As you look at President Trump's re-election prospects, what are his strengths? What are his weaknesses going to be?
His strengths, he has an understanding for his supporters, and we've seen that repeatedly. He has this solid base of support in the low 40s that's not going anywhere. It's been interesting to see over these past few weeks, even as polling suggests support for the impeachment inquiry has grown, even support for removal from office has grown. His job approval numbers stay the same. I think when we think about the president, he had a very narrow path to winning the election in 2016, and he did that. He made that happen. He has a narrow path to re-election. He could also make that happen. It's why it's really important. The electability question, I think, is kind of a challenging one for Democrats, but it's why it is so important for them, because they can't overlook the possibility that he can thread those states together again, or maybe lose one but pick up another one. He does have a path to re-election. He is a competitive incumbent.
I think the politics of impeachment are pretty unknown right now. What are you going to be watching for if this process plays out? He is impeached by the House and heads into the election year with this asterisk by his name, a president who's been impeached.
Well, I think one of the things we have to kind of look at is whether some of this has just been digested already. It is unprecedented for a president to go into re-election with this asterisk by his name, but people have pretty much made up their minds about Donald Trump. You either think he is a threat to democracy, or you think that he is saving America. And impeachment, I'm not sure will change that.
Stephen Sloan, AP's national political editor. We're going to be hearing a lot from you on Ground Game over the next year. I hope you are well rested for the year ahead.
I will try.
Stephen, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
When we come back, we head to Iowa, where candidates are staking their hopes on the early caucus state.
The question you're going to have to ask yourself when you caucus in January and you vote in November is, what's next for America?
This is Ground Game, and I'm Julie Pace. It's a moment that's now part of Democratic lore. Barack Obama's rousing speech at the 2007 Jefferson-Jackson dinner in Iowa. A breakout performance that put Obama on the path to victory in the Iowa caucuses. The dinner has a new name now, but the goal for the candidates is still the same: to come out of the party event with a burst of momentum at a critical juncture of the primary. Tom Beaumont is AP's national political reporter based in Des Moines. Tom is fresh off the dinner, and the first question, Tom, of course, is what is the new name of the Jefferson-Jackson dinner?
It's now called the Liberty and Justice Celebration.
Oh,
and I
catchy.
think it's because they wanted to take Jackson, who has a pretty spotty history with civil rights, out of there, and I don't know why they wanted to take Jefferson out, but it's now Liberty and Justice.
The Liberty and Justice Celebration. So for our listeners who are not familiar with this dinner, paint us a picture here. This is not, your average run-of-the-mill party dinner, right?
No, it's not. In fact, it's the largest gathering of Democrats before the National Convention next year. If people saw it on TV, they might have thought that it was like a boxing match or something like that, because it was just this huge arena, 13,000 people. All of the campaigns are organized and have their cheering sections, with the thunder sticks and lights. if you're watching on TV, you didn't catch a lot of that, but that's what's going on in the arena. It's an attempt to show that these campaigns have organization and they can mobilize their supporters 3 months out.
And as I mentioned, this Obama speech in 2007 has taken on a bit of a life of its own. But tell me why that was such a galvanizing moment for Obama, and why do other campaigns want to try to replicate that in your home state?
In 2007, he was starting to rise and the momentum was becoming clear. And it was a moment where he really drew a stark contrast with then national and Iowa frontrunner Hillary Clinton. You know, he said, we're not going to run a focus grouped campaign. We're not going to run the same old triangulation. It was a real shot at Clinton. And he said something like, it's not about not answering questions because we don't want to say something that's going to get criticized by Mitt and Rudy. And he was calling out then the Republican leaders, you know, for the Republican nomination. So he was really throwing down the gauntlet against her.
I saw a lot of campaigns coming out of this year's dinner trying to make the case that they had a breakout moment, that this was the moment that was going to turn things around for that. Pete Buttigieg's advisors were saying that. Kamala Harris's advisors were saying that. You were there. You saw all of these candidates speak. Who had the strongest performances of the night? Who has the chance to really turn that dinner into momentum with 100 days until Iowa?
That's a really good question because it is 100 days out. And a good speech 100 days out is one thing, but a good speech that's built on the combination of curiosity that's already taken root in Iowa and organization is something different. And Harris did give a very good speech, but her organization in Iowa, her commitment to Iowa has been up and down. It's been spotty. If you looked at the speeches that Warren gave and Buttigieg gave, they were both very strong. I thought Warren's closing was really strong when she condemned those who would dream small and give up early, and that she had committed a lifetime to fighting for working families. It was very aggressive. It was built around fighting. And then flip side was Buttigieg, who said, you know, we're building a campaign based on a culture of belonging in a country where people don't feel they belong anymore. And that fighting for the sake of fighting's own purpose is not the point. So I thought that those two campaigns, given their momentum in Iowa, their organization in Iowa, and now what looks like some pretty strong contrasting rhetorical lines, they looked really strong. In between there was, unfortunately for him, was Joe Biden, whose supporters in Iowa really thought that this was a moment that they could build something, demonstrate some strength, show that he's not just giving the same old speech. And what he did was sort of give the same old speech. So he was sort of bookended by the two candidates that are really growing in Iowa right now.
That is increasingly the story in Iowa. Of course, Bernie Sanders, and we can talk about him in a couple minutes, but increasingly it does feel like the story in Iowa is some solid support for Joe Biden still, but these contrasting styles between Pete Buttigieg and Elizabeth Warren, and you can almost feel the energy and the momentum, at least in your home state, starting to move toward them. What does that look like on the ground? What are the groups of voters that you're going to be watching over the next couple of months as we try to see, you know, who's got what it really takes to win the caucuses? There is such a strong coalition for both campaigns right now. But Warren is really attracting a lot of women of all ages, and certainly men too, you know, left of center, you know, sort of far left of center men. But she has got a very strong coalition of women's groups, young women, college women, you know, retired women. It's not her only strength, certainly, but it is, I would say, the core of her strength. And for Buttigieg, he appeals, of course, strongly to the LGBTQ community, but he has a very tangible youth element. I won't say that he doesn't also attract a lot of baby boomers. In fact, a lot of baby boomers say to me, look, my generation has been unable to fix these things. And so, you know, I sort of approach these voters thinking, well, of course, they think that somebody younger than them shouldn't be president. But a lot of them say, are you kidding?
my generation has screwed this up. My generation hasn't been able to fix this. It's time for someone who's 37 years old, and they don't blink at the idea of Buttigieg.
That is fascinating that you have older voters who think that their peers, essentially the Joe Bidens, the Warrens, the Sanders, need to step aside for this younger guy.
It's not rare. It happens all the time because you see, Iowa is a disproportionately older state. And so I kind of think that if he has a breakthrough among older voters, it might say something for the rest of the contests that come down the road.
The other thing that I think is really interesting about Iowa, and you touched on this a little bit when you were talking about Warren supporters, is I think nationally we think of Iowa as a conservative-leaning state. Certainly it's moved that way in the last couple of elections, but in a Democratic primary, there is a really powerful, forceful, progressive, liberal streak to the Democratic electorate, right?
Oh, there is. I mean, it's the place where Howard Dean had his moment of glory. Sure, he finished third in the caucuses, but, it's Tom Harkin's state who, inherited the mantle of Paul Wellstone. I mean, there is a strong progressive left of center contingent in the Democratic base for sure.
Iowa is also a graveyard for political candidates. And we're entering this stretch right now where you've got some candidates who are starting to have to make some really tough decisions, whether to go all in Iowa, whether to cut back in other places, whether to drop out entirely. When we get beyond those front runners, what do the strengths of the field look like? And are there any people you're keeping an eye on, sort of wondering, I don't know if they're actually going to make it to caucus day here?
I'll say to half of that question, I've been surprised at, especially after this dinner this weekend, at a lot of the people in the Cedar Rapids area, it's the second largest city, who say that they're for Amy Klobuchar. And she is definitely in their top three, which is an important thing because now it becomes this elimination game. Caucus goers, they gather their lists and they think, I like this one, I like this one, I like this one. And they more start to eliminate people than add people. But Klobuchar is hanging in there. She has a good organization and she's getting around. And I was surprised at the amount of support she had from people that I talked to in Cedar Rapids.
She's from a neighboring state, Minnesota, just north of Iowa.
Right, and Cedar Rapids is in the northeastern part of Iowa. Harris has said now for several weeks that she's going all in Iowa. And when she visits, she doesn't hold a whole lot of events. That's one thing. But also, she had a real pop of popularity and interest and curiosity early in the year, in January and February. And there was just nothing ever that really came in to backfill that as far as organization goes. Those are the two things. You need some interest and some organization. And people love her when they see her, but there's very little organization behind it. And so she has said again this weekend that she's going all in Iowa, but that's now come at the expense of, most of her New Hampshire staff. So it's kind of, borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. So I think she continues through caucus day, but, what was once a, potential top finisher, she always said that she could finish in the top three. Now it's in question whether or not she'll be able to do that. I also wonder about Cory Booker, who had a real strong start, hired some really interesting people, really good people, solid Iowa people, as well as having some good national consultants on board. And he's just failed to crack that top. And I think some of that was stolen by Buttigieg. The energy was stolen by Buttigieg. Some of it was stolen by O'Rourke. And maybe it was just a failure to really vault the way people thought maybe a year ago that he could.
And we did say goodbye to one candidate over the past week, Beto O'Rourke, the former Texas congressman. He started out this campaign with a bang. He was in Iowa. He was standing on tables, standing on counters at coffee shops, cameras following him everywhere. And he ended his campaign with a real whimper, not much money behind him anymore. What went wrong for Beto O'Rourke, Tom?
I think he hit his high point when he ran for Senate against Ted Cruz. I mean, that was like a national high point. And I don't know how in retrospect, how you take that and turn that into a demand to be the Democratic nominee in a field of other people who also have skills like his, rhetorical skills, youth, that kind of thing. I guess that's one way of saying that I think Buttigieg got in earlier than he did, began building earlier than he did, putting together a team, raising money. I think he stole some of his thunder. But all I know is that there were several hundred O'Rourke supporters standing out there waving their signs as some of them were looking at their phones, seeing that he had dropped out of the race on Friday.
Now looking for a new candidate, and it just goes to show there are no sure things in presidential politics. Tom Beaumont, AP's national political writer based in Des Moines, Iowa. You've got a busy stretch ahead of you, and we look forward to talking to you soon on Ground Game.
Thanks, Julie. It was fun.
That's it for this week's Ground Game from the Associated Press. We'll be here every Wednesday with the latest political news from the Beltway and beyond. Be sure to tell a friend about us, and please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. From the Westwood One Podcast Network.